We're ready to start processing the data for our primary data product that's based on a deployment of a photosynthetically active radiation instrument. And now that we're ready to start processing those data, we need to make sure that we're keeping the maintenance of our metadata directly together with the maintenance of our data. And one good way to do that is to use literate programming tools like Rmarkdown. So this gives us a good excuse to start learning a little bit more about how to build an Rmarkdown project. So I've got my RStudio project here, and I'm going to go ahead and open up RStudio with that project. In this case, we're using a .r profile file in our project that is changing our working directory. So our working directory should be the root of the pipeline rather than the protocol file. So if I do a get working directory, you can see I'm in the root of PAR deployment rather than in the protocol folder of that PAR deployment. And now I want to get started with Rmarkdown. Now there's a couple ways to open up a new Rmarkdown file. An Rmarkdown file is just another kind of text file. I can either go to the little arrow next to the new file icon, and you should see Rmarkdown here, or I can go to File, New File, and you'll see Rmarkdown. RStudio knows what Rmarkdown is and gives you lots of tools for dealing with Rmarkdown. So I'm going to go ahead and select this. Now, when you create an Rmarkdown file, RStudio asks you for a bunch of information. And actually, I'm going to delete all of the things it does with this information. So I'm not going to worry about filling any of this in because I want to start from scratch to make sure you have a good foundation for understanding how Rmarkdown works. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And all of that information that was in that window is what's showing up here at the top. This is what's called the YAML header that we've talked about before. And this is how you get information to the tools that are compiling Rmarkdown. This isn't Markdown itself, it's just information about how you want to compile the Rmarkdown. When you open up a new Rmarkdown file in RStudio, it's going to give you an example. So there's a bunch of stuff in here with examples of how Rmarkdown works, but I'm going to build that up from scratch. So I'm going to go ahead and delete all of this. Also going to delete all of this information because we're going to get information to the compiler in a different way, or the renderer in a different way. And also, I prefer the option of using a page title here because I would like what shows up at the top of my report to be what I give as a header as opposed to this title. If I call this page title, this is not going to show up at the top of my rendered report. I am going to put in a title, though, that makes some sense, and I'm going to call this PAR deployment to match the nature of my primary data product. So that's the YAML header. That's information that the tools that render the document is going to use. Now, an Rmarkdown document is really just Markdown to begin with. The body of the document is mostly Markdown, and then it's going to have R code embedded in the Markdown. And we'll talk about how that works in a minute. But first, let's go ahead and just get things started with a little bit of Markdown and make sure we can get this working. So I'm going to have a first level header that you could start with a £sign in Markdown. So my first header is going to say PAR deployment at the top of my document. And let's say I want to describe this a little bit. Now, I'm not going to force you to sit here and have you watch me type this out. Let me copy something here from my notes. I'm just going to add some paragraph material. And again, remember that in Markdown, the formatting doesn't matter. The extra line feeds don't matter. I like to keep my code narrow within 80 characters. So this is just the beginning of a paragraph. In this case, there's just one sentence saying sensors measuring photosynthetically active radiation were deployed during the growing season of 2021 at select locations on the Moccasin Terrace located in the lower elevations of the Judith River watershed in Montana, USA. So just getting started with a little bit of metadata here, just to give you an illustration of how we are going to put some narrative metadata into the Markdown parts of an Rmarkdown file. And now let's go ahead and see if we can get this working. So there are a couple of ways of dealing with Rmarkdown. Oh, well, first, but we have to save this file. Right now it's still untitled, which means we haven't saved it anywhere yet. So I'm going to save this file by clicking on, I can either click on this save icon or this save icon. Because it's not titled yet, it's going to bring up a window asking me, well, where do you want to put this and what do you want to call it? Now remember, my working directory is par deployment, but where I want to put this protocol related information, this is code, is in the protocol folder. So I want to make sure I put this file in the protocol folder. And this is a particular step in the process. So I'm actually going to put a number here first and call it processing, because I'm going to ultimately have more than one bit of code for dealing with these data and for generating my data product. And this is just the first step. So I'm going to call this one_processing.rmd, capital RMD. Actually, I don't have to put the extension here. It should do it for me because it's saving it as type RMD. So if I save that, if I go to my protocol folder, I should now see a file called one_processing.rmd. Now, if I want to knit or I want to render this into a document, there are ways I can do that from RStudio. There's this knit button. And if I just hit this knit button, it's going to process the file with some defaults. And by default, if you don't tell it otherwise, it's going to create an HTML document. And RStudio will go ahead and bring up that HTML document in its own browser. And you can see that we have par deployment and sensors measuring photosynthetically active radiation were deployed during the growing season of 2021, etc. So we can always do this from RStudio, but if we really want to make sure our workflow is completely automated, there are other ways to do this. And the way I prefer to do this is to write my own code to call the Rmarkdown render function directly. And that gives me a lot more control on how it's done. First of all, if you look at what happened, where the HTML file got created was in the protocol directory. Ultimately, that's not where I want it to go. I don't want it in the protocol directory. This is documentation that's generated. And in this case, this is actually something that I'm going to want to put in the incremental directory. Also, I want to call it something else. Now, there are ways to adjust how init does things by clicking on this right arrow, but I actually prefer the control I have by calling the function to render the document myself. And that also disconnects me from having to use manual tools in RStudio for my workflow. So next, let's talk a little bit about how we might render this ourselves rather than having RStudio do it. To render this Rmarkdown document with our own code, first we're going to need our own script. Now in this case, this is not going to be Rmarkdown, it's just going to be an R script. Let's go ahead and save this. And typically I like to call this the same thing as the Rmarkdown file. One quick way to do that is to say, I want to see all files in this folder, not just those with an R extension. And I'm going to say, well, I want to call this the same thing as my Rmarkdown file, except I don't want the Rmarkdown extension. I'm just going to call it one_rprocessing. And I'm going to change this back to .r so it'll automatically put the R extension on there, or I could just type the R extension on there as well, either way. And now, in addition to the processing, the one_processing RMD file, I have a one_processing.r file. And the function that I want to use to render this is called render, and it's part of the Rmarkdown package. So in R, there's a couple of ways I could do this. I could do a library for Rmarkdown. And what this will do is load in the Rmarkdown library and let me use the functions that are defined in the Rmarkdown library. Or I can also tell it to load a function from a library directly when I call the function, in which case I can put in Rmarkdown with 2 colons saying I'm going to access the Rmarkdown library and I want to call the function render. Now there are going to be several different items or arguments that I need to pass to render for it to do its job. We can do a help on render. And there's several different arguments that we have the ability to set in order to take full control over what happens in terms of where it's getting the data and where it's putting the data when it's rendering a report. First of all, I need to tell it, well, what's the input? Which file are you rendering? And this is where we needed to tell it where our Markdown file is. So this needs to be a character string with a path in it. RStudio knows I'm putting in a path. And recall, now that my working directory is the root, I need to put a dot slash. Instead of two dots, I just put a single dot. That means I start at my working directory and I put a slash and I want to go to the protocol folder because that's where my RMD file is. Then I can hit tab again and find the file name, and it's one_processing.rmd. So that's my input. That's the file that I want to read and process for doing the rendering. It's important to tell it what's the output format. I think you saw by default when we did it with RStudio, it created an HTML file. But let's make sure that it always creates an HTML file. So I want to use the string HTML document, pass that to the format, and that's what tells it to create an HTML file as the report format. I need to tell it where to put the results in terms of an output directory. So I can specify the output dir argument. And again, this is going to be relative paths. So I can put a dot slash. I'm going to hit tab to get RStudio to suggest things. Now where I want to put this is actually going to be in the incremental folder. So this is processing. This is something that it's going to be detailed notes on processing the data that I'm not sure belong necessarily with the product. This is about the processing that people who want to reproduce the product need to know, but not necessarily just the people who want to use the data want to know. So this, I think, is appropriate for the 3 incremental folder. Now that folder doesn't exist yet, but that is ultimately where I want it to go. And the output file is the name of the file that I want to put in that output directory. And in this case, that's going to be processing_notes.html. So this is the report on the processing that's going into a file called processingnotes.html in the incremental directory. And then lastly, because of the way I have the working directory set up, I need to tell Rmarkdown what the root directory is it should use for any relative paths. Because it typically is going to use the same location as where this RMD file is. That's by default where the tools in Rmarkdown are going to think of as the working directory for all the relative paths in the code. However, I've made changes to that. I want the root of the pipeline to be the working directory, not this protocol directory. So I have to specifically tell it what to use as the root directory. And the argument for that is the init root directory. And in this case, I just want it to use my current working directory. I don't want it to use where the RMD file is. I want it to use my working directory, which is this par deployment directory. And I know, because I'm using relative paths, that that is going to be my working directory, so I can be specific about that. So let's see what happens when I run this. Looks like it says output created, 3 incremental processing notes. Now it's interesting that 3 incremental output directory didn't exist before I ran that, but now we can see it's there. So one of the features of render is that even if that directory doesn't exist, render knows how to create it even if it doesn't exist. Now, not all functions that write to files will do that. Sometimes if you give it a path that doesn't exist, it will actually throw an error. But in this case, render will create the folder for us if it doesn't already exist. I can go to that incremental folder. If I click on this processing notes, I can bring it up in a web browser. And here is that file in my web browser, PAR deployment, sensors measured photosynthetically reactive radiation, etc. So now I have just Markdown, but I'm using the Rmarkdown render tool to compile it and render it into an HTML document that I can view in a web browser. I can also look at it using my File Explorer in Windows. If I go to PAR deployment, incremental, yes, I can see that processing notes is indeed there. And I can also open up that HTML file from that directory.